Hello, good people. But now you know the deal. If the camera angle is off, it's not by design. I'm blind and it comes with the territory. One of the fascinating things about South African politics at present, post the 2024 elections and leading up to those elections, is how things are ironically leading to a situation that is explosive. I don't want to say things are resolving themselves, because at the zenith of this path, we just don't know how matters are going to be like at the other end. So you have a series of events. Some are major, some seem benign, some seem totally insignificant. But they slowly but surely building up, building up, building up. Right? And some people make pronouncements on these, but they're just written off. And or you kind of see things shaping up, but they are happening at a snail's pace. Take, for example, the endless legal disputes happening in the judiciary to resolve political questions. Right? It's either factions within the African National Congress are appealing outcomes of conferences, or there's a disagreement amongst parties in parliament about, in essence, things that should be resolved through common sense and settling differences in our politics. But it doesn't work that way, right? Those who have the means, those who have the resources, and arguably those who we are told understand the law better, understand the Constitution better, or who are protecting the Constitution or protecting democracy, or however spin you want to put on this, they often come up tops, right? So take the Democratic Alliance. When last did they have a misinterpretation of law? Are you telling me at all times this is the only party that seems to understand the law with such clarity, considering how fuzzy the law can be at times, considering some of the things that they argue at times? I mean, at this point in South African law, the DA arguably could argue anything and they probably would get away with it. And I think, in part, that is what is happening in the GNU at the moment. The DA is flexing its financial muscle, its superiority in terms of resources, and it aligns with the faction that is perhaps under siege politically within the African National Congress. We should not get it twisted. The factions within the African National Congress are huge, perhaps bigger than what they were before. The only difference is that the most critical voices of the factions, right, because there were several factions, have gone outside the ANC. Right? They've taken their struggle elsewhere. They've taken their struggle to the people. Right? To say that we can no longer reconcile matters politically with those who we have deemed to be comrades for a long, long time. That said, there are still voices within Gwakoko that hold a different opinion, but now they just don't have that potency, right? And they don't have that gravitas, that oomph, that political mastery that's required to win critical points and to overcome important moments in political events. And this decline in the progressive voices, characterize them as you will, right? I mean, there are endless headlines about how we can view factions within the ANC, but it happened since the 2017 NASREC elections, right? We know the story about that, right? We know about the allegations of serious money being spent to win that election. By what? 100 votes or so? Right? A narrow margin for now the incumbent President Ramaphosa, right? And then he consolidates that power 5 years on, under extraordinary circumstances as well, right? Yes, fine, there wasn't really a serious contender for power at that point in time, but in a normal environment, in a politically astute context, you wouldn't have President Ramaphosa win when it is known that the Pala matter is a poisonous chalice, right? Like that in itself was extraordinary. For that matter not to even be discussed at conference, it was exceptional. And you almost knew at that point that kuphelile ANC, it's over, right? You sensed it, because there was a palpable mood shift. It was stronger, much stronger than the 2017 one. Right? The 2017 one was like, bashayile conference. This is not cool. But yazini, let's go to 2019. Let's try at least make this thing work, nyana. And maybe we will still play by the same rules with any Congolese. Nganti no, power doesn't work that way. Power consolidates, and this is what comrades within the ANC never seem to understand. Right? They never seem to understand that capitalism doesn't play that game. It's not about fairness. It's not about democracy. It's never about these equality, justice, all these things that are indicative of value-orientated democracy and trying to level the playing field, so to speak. Right? Capitalism evolves and it becomes better at control. And so in 2022, when ukabanguti you can use 2002 tactics to win conference, it cannot be. If anything, it shows you up as an incompetent, ignorant politician. You're out of your depth. And if anything, it shows the other faction as clearly on top of things. Right? Bullies within politics know that they can establish their own rules. They can change up things. They can switch up, right? Yeah, we did that yesterday. We used to vote, comrades, fairly so. But namhlanje ziyabuya baba. Faka imali uzobona. You get what I'm saying? Now, when imali, you clearly don't have. Can you match my funder? No. Wena uhlangana nobani esentini? Bayakwazi esentini. Abakwazi. And that's pretty much the story, right? And unfortunately for the ANC, it's always been a battleground, not only for local politics, but for global politics. It was a party established by and large for international interests as well. I know we speak about the nobility of, it was a land struggle. Yes, it was. For the natives. Because they realized that, you know what, we are not part of this government that has been constituted by the Boers and the English following the big war of 1899. And now these people are making laws to dispossess us and displace us of our resources. But there's something to be said about reporting to the monarch in the UK. Right? There's something to be said about the Soviet Union connection. There's something to be said about the Middle East connection. There's something to be said about the Israeli connection, and so on and so forth. Right? It's where global forces meet, China included. And sometimes you just have to wonder that, are people considering these dynamics at all times when events happen within the ANC? So yeah, one of these factions go and then they create umkhonto wesizwe. But something significant happens, right? In that umkhonto wesizwe also then becomes about consolidating a base. So on the one hand, you've got economic/capitalism and its interest consolidating. On the other, though belatedly, you have a rethinking and a new approach of bringing the base together, coalescing around a vision. Now, I say belatedly deliberately so, because some of these things have been talked about for quite some time. Just because they never get mainstreamed doesn't mean that, no, these are novel ideas, right? Some of the critique that people like President Zuma have been receiving, particularly during the years of his presidency, has been that he's not radical enough, right? He's not progressive enough. Note, enough. Not to say that there was no leaning towards certain things, but it simply means that the ground was not fully satisfied about the pace at which things were moving. Right? We can rewrite history again and pretend as if, oh no, people were all happy. No, it wasn't necessarily so, because there were frustrations, right? There was this feeling of, why are we happy with, settling with the elite? Why are we always helping them? Again, perhaps because at the time there was no political education that satisfied the knowledge on the ground about politics, economics, and how these mainly serve the interest of the elite, right? But the more President Zuma started giving audience, or at least giving his ear to radical voices, the more interesting things became, right? The more interesting things became. There would be a breakdown in relations between him and the other political elite, right? And others, of course, right? The fracturing of the ANC started happening more rapidly. And we've talked, and there's been coverage of all these various events and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to get into those. But it has resulted to what we have today. And essentially, today's environment, your GNU, the grand coalition between the Democratic Alliance and the ANC, I say that deliberately as well. Go figure, right? And now the MK and EFF and others, it was bound to happen. The question was, how was it going to happen, and who was going to lead in that happening, right? I won't lie. I'm one of the people sure made predictions in the lead up to elections and so on and so forth, right? And thankfully got most of them right, because now I've got some audience, at least 2-3 people who'll be like, okay, I know. But I didn't think before that, if you'd asked me this in 2021 or 2020, that would President Zuma be the person to shift the political landscape in South Africa, I probably would have said, I don't necessarily think so, right? I don't necessarily think so. I don't see it happening. He cares too deeply about his beloved ANC, right? And the shenanigans of that ANC. He would rather protect that than expose them. And so now the base is consolidating, but the base does not have finances. Right? But who says that you always need finances, right? Um, Another point that perhaps can be discussed at another time. But the thing is that coincidences, if there are indeed coincidences, don't cease to happen, right? They still are. Take, for example, this idea of friction between Guafaru and Moses, right? It's dominating discussions, in at least in those circles, right? Progressive circles. But is it really such a significant thing? Yeah, in terms of unifying forces, because it will present much more of a problem to elite interests in South Africa. But when you start looking at how Guafaru are operating as constitutionalists, self-proclaimed, right? You start realizing that, this is a bit interesting now, right? You have the economic freedom fighters who are not advocating for the upending of the system, but rather tweaking it, tinkering with it, right? To make it workable for who, well, we can debate that. But yes, workable nonetheless. But even those attempts are being foiled, right? And then that leads to how people perceive economics, law and order, constitutionalism in South Africa, particularly people who feel disenfranchised, right? So if you have the EFF saying that, no, this issue is fixable, let's use the constitution appropriately. But then those things are not being resolved. And constitutional means are being used, or legal means, I should argue, right, are being used to stop the EFF from changing the land laws, for example, addressing issues of equality, right, poverty, resource management in the country. What do you think is happening psychologically to people? And then on the other hand, so that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you've got MK, who's like, Atina Sispalis Kenyan, right? Says really. We want none of this. Upend this thing, let's change it, let's have a new system. So they end up assisting each other. We might not see it at face value, but when you study it, those coincidences in terms of how things are playing out become a little more interesting, don't they? At least for me, in my little mind. So, what's happening within the MK? The MK's first move was to have some foothold in the political landscape. Yes, it would have been ideal for the MK to win decisively. It is their position that, oh no, we did win, but we got cheated. It will be interesting to see when they present that evidence, right? But Nevertheless, they have illustrated this point, and it was an important point. Because politics is a numbers game. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. But it's more important in the MK situation because the MK was firstly dismissed by mainstream society. I'm talking about middle class now, right? But like, surely he's not going to do much damage. Surely it cannot be. I mean, will he get more than the 10% the EFF got? No. Right? And asabongamla abasho njalo, ironically, yeah, fine. I mean, bakhona lapho, the ignorant ones. But laba baqava gain grand, they knew ukuthi no, something is happening here. Right? Angikhulumi ngabantu abafonela ama-radio station wenu lapho. But anyway, they were dismissed. So that was the first hurdle that they had to overcome. Register our legitimacy. Register us as an actual threat to those who don't think we're a threat. Because why? It's about narrative at that point in time. If you were to ask me right now, I don't think the MK thought they would govern, even if they had a majority vote. I don't think so. And I say this because of what I'm going to say now. We've heard the electioneering prior to 29 May 2024. But under the guise of building up to the local government elections in 2026, they're using the same language that they used prior to the elections. Fine, that shows consistency. That's good for them. But then you need to kind of study, when are they doing this? Not too many people are campaigning for LGE 2026 at this point in time. But tactically, what the MK is doing is that they're using these by-elections to test the waters, to see whether the elections campaign can be ongoing. It makes them relevant, a discussion point in news and current affairs shows, right? And it also adds the wow factor constantly. Yo, but we need the food. Oh gosh, I can't believe that they keep on voting for this party, right? Good grief. So that is ongoing. But interestingly, in the last few weeks to a couple of months, if you listen to those messages, then you start realizing that there's a different undertone here. So you have SG with MK, Onyeko Floyd Shivamp, right? Of course, my current jersey number 10 in South African politics, but that's an aside. He has been doing heavy political schooling, even in settings that are traditionally not about political schooling, right? Like in a presser, usually you don't give master classes about the political landscape and how you are viewing it. Yeah, you may drop gems, right? Some quotables, and and some views, but Shivambu has been lecturing essentially, right? Political education, and it's a very smart move on their end because it's utilizing prime time, or at least disseminating their messaging, right? And it's nothing bad or anything like that, but it's really an articulation of politics as we see them in South Africa. I mean, the whole breakdown of the camps, right? Strategic allies versus political opponents versus enemy, and all of that. It was brilliant, but it was also important, right? It makes you think. It makes you consider, why is this articulation necessary at this point in time? But then he goes to Mtanzana in the Eastern Cape. And he gives a historical / political lecture there. And you can see and kind of feel the impact of his words in that speech, that yabathinta labantu laba. Right? I don't know how big that audience is, but I don't necessarily think that's the most important thing at this point in time. But it's more about what he says, right? And he talks about issues of disenfranchising the black majority. He talks about economics. He talks about these things in the context of colonialism and apartheid. And it was also interesting that he talks about taxation in that context, because why? It wasn't coincident. It's because tax is topical at the moment. But for him and for the MK, they don't necessarily speak of taxation in terms of the whole VAT issue in this particular gathering, right? In others, yes, they do talk about VAT and the hike and all those type of things. But in this meeting, it becomes about taxation as a means to subjugate the majority. It has been an instrument for oppression. Now that's quite serious. But then he ups the ante and he refers to the Freedom Charter and what the Freedom Charter encapsulates, all its important messages about the resources and the land belonging to the people. And so he uses then these points to drive at how these are not necessarily radical ideas, but ideas that once upon a time, even the people who are in power today told everyone they believed in. And this accomplishes a number of things, right? But the most important ones, it then begs the question for those watching and listening, like, how come the ANC is no longer a proponent of the Freedom Charter. They want to mark the anniversary of the document, but they're not really emphasizing how they're going to ensure that it becomes a reality. And when you understand the history of the Freedom Charter, you also understand that this was not a pro-black document, right? I mean, radicals actually criticize the Freedom Charter. They actually do. It was truly more of a settlement amongst various voices in South African society, right? Your Pan-Africanists, but also your liberals, right? White folk from Europe who had basically said that, you know what, this is our new home as well. And it was considered to be an extraordinary problematic document for the apartheid government. And interestingly, today, it is a difficult document for even those who said they adopted it. The ANC. You know, I was actually thinking to myself, if we were operating in pre-94 times, the ANC perhaps would be allowed to be a political operative, would be an actual political party participating in parliament. The EFF, maybe, borderline. The MK, definitely not. Right? It's interesting. And sometimes you just got to apply principles retrospectively in different eras and think about what you've got going at the moment. And you'll be amazed the outcomes you reach. You might actually think you're ridiculous, and I'm sure some will say I'm being ridiculous at this point in time. So anyway, you have then the SG making those type of noises. But his messaging is essentially about the dehumanization of black people. But it strikes a chord, right? Because it doesn't just sound like rhetoric, right? This is not a message to be discussed in the press for show and all these type of things, and then we become excitable and right, and then sing "Kill the Poor," and then everybody's like, "Why are we singing "Kill the Poor?" and then blah blah blah. No. It becomes quite significant because this is a close meeting by all intents and purposes. That's kind of happening between an SG and a constituency of his, right? He's not trying to convince other people. He's educating his own constituency. And then you have President Zuma. President Zuma is speaking about the legendary Solomon Mahlangu, an MK soldier. MK as in the Liberation Army, who, for those who don't know, was hanged at a very tender age by the apartheid government. And in political circles, in liberation circles, his legacy is that of a rebel, right? A young lion, right? Someone who just did not give it up, right? For him, the struggle was sacrosanct, even though he was a young man, and he died for what he believed in. And he said the blood will nourish. the tree, right? But when you speak about Solomon Mahlangu, you evoke strong emotions. It's a message that resonates profoundly. But then when he continues to speak about Solomon Mahlangu, he deviates somewhat, right? The Solomon Mahlangu lectures become a framing device. Make it an excuse, if you will, for those who would prefer viewing things that way. But it's a framing device, nevertheless, for the talks, for the speeches, for the discussions, opening up the door to be like, when I speak and say things that shock you, they're now palatable. Accept them. Why? Because I'm talking about a very important figure here. A man, young as he was, who was willing to give it all up. Right? And implicitly, he knows that the people know the story of Solomon Mahlangu. Right? And it also helps that, of course, that Solomon Mahlangu's relatives, his sister, is also now part of MK. Big point that. But he knows that there are songs about Solomon Mahlangu, right? Isoja elabulala mapu. Do you get what I'm saying? Like his history is documented in the most authentic African way, right? Through oral history, it resonates. When people hear Solomon Mahlangu's name, they think song. And what better way of carrying your legacy through that? But he then talks about the death of the ANC. He makes it sound comical, but it's an important point. Because it's like, there's nothing there anymore, people. And he then distinguishes himself, whether you agree or not, from those who have remained, or those who are controlling the ANC, to say that the heart of the ANC has left. I cherish the heart of the ANC. And then it becomes a question of who's going to fight for the ANC. We've seen the fight happen within the ANC. We've seen the fight happen within the courts. But now it's happening outside. But then he goes further. He ties his own history to that of Solomon Mahlangu, talking about his own oppression. But then he extends that and talks about another critical event. Then one that was very upsetting, but kind of underplayed in South Africa, which is the 2021 civil unrest in July, where he was then taken to prison. And it then becomes an illustration of this is how heartless and unfair and unjust and cruel the system is. That then becomes the message. And for his audience, then it is a question of if they're able to do that to a former president. And I think he even asked this question. Right? No, it's the SG, Shivambu, who asked that question. What about you then as the ordinary person? What chance do you stand as an individual? And then he goes on to say that, well, myself and others have taken the decision to fight for this legacy, but more importantly, to fight for our freedom, full freedom. And by that, it's the whole messages about decolonization, nationalization of resources, etc., etc. A new political system. But then he says something that really underscores where they are at present in terms of how they're thinking about the situation. Right? Noma kumnyama, noma kubovu. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? It tells me, at the very least, illiterate as I am about these things, that the MK knows very well that it may win votes, it may win the politics, but they'll never be able to govern. And what happens then? What happens then? So, upping the ante. They are essentially igniting a revolution. They're basically telling their constituency and society at large that freedom is not going to come easy. It'll have to be wrestled. And indeed, we may win the politics, we may win elections, but that's not going to be enough. Because those who we are fighting against will never accept us as a legitimate government. Because ultimately, this is all about power. This is all about economics. It's all about who's controlling resources. Not who's the administrator. That has maybe been the fight for the last 30 years. But who is in control? Who says, for example, how the ports in KwaZulu-Natal should be used? How the ports in the Western Cape should be used, and how these then impact global events. How relations become shaped in Africa. Because whether we like it or not, there's a wave happening in Africa at the moment, right? We know that there's a renewed effort to decolonize. We can debate the principles and how this is happening and so on and so forth, but it's an event nonetheless. And this is where the new scramble for Africa supposedly is going to happen, right? Between the East and the West. Right? There'll be forces, global ones, that support the revolutionary activities, and there'll be those who oppose it. And there'll be a lot of language about democratization and fairness and all of that used in media in terms of how we understand these events and so on and so forth. But on the ground as well, people would have internalized this message differently. What does it mean for a South African context? What does it mean for people who find themselves in a shack without food, without adequate health care, without access to a school for their kids. People who are destitute. You see, the thing is, in South Africa, the middle class always seems to miss one point. The middle class simply thinks that for as long as we can give crumbs now and again to this working class, you know what, ngicasha ubhoy nje ozongigezela imoto yami, or nami sengifana njengobhasi so uzongenzela ingadi yami, or whatever the case may be, right? Then they think to themselves, it solves the problem. And that's the thing about black people as a middle class in South Africa, right? They've truly adopted the mindsets of the apartheid middle class, right? They really truly, it's no longer just sloganeering and speaking ill of the middle class, right? They really truly view themselves in that image, in that way, right? And the borderline people, right? And I speak like this because I'm also arguably part of that. So I know these things, I can see these things happening around me, right? It's not a case of, oh no, I'm distinguishing myself and all this type of things. But for all intents and purposes, I'm middle class black in South Africa. And these truths need to be told. We need to speak about these things. And so we're disillusioned, right? We adopt this mindset of surely maybe I understand it now, man. We can't have a chaos, la. Maybe we in order, la. You know, things have to be done properly. Yabo, singabo madam nabo basinyana manje. Sesiyazibona ngama credit card angekho, right? Unesikoloto, imoto nawe uyayikoloda ebhenki, awunandlu, wona le flat lelo hlala kulo, you don't even own it. Like, you know, it's just chaotic, but still, you still think that you're better than that. But the point I'm making here is more about the fact that the middle class in its entirety fools itself into thinking that these crumbs are sufficient. But when it comes to the heart of it, if the ruling class is willing to fight wars, global ones, to maintain control, why do you think poor people are not willing to do the same? Why do you fool yourself into thinking that these people will be okay eternally with being in poverty and will accept all these inequities that they live in? It's bananas. Like, it's the most ludicrous thing. And so the MK is now preparing the space because they know that this is where their votes come from. They're just preparing them to say that this matter is going to escalate. Because you will never be considered to be a legitimate controller, owner of South Africa. And hence they use that type of language. Izinto zethu. It's our companies. When they speak about state-owned entities, that's the language that they speak about in the MK. They don't even say it's the people's, right? Ezethu. Why? Because they see themselves as part of the people. They have the same mindset. They have their interests at heart. And so the language then is being retched up. They speak about ukuthi vele le ndoda le nsizwa lezi zithanda isibhamu, shaya isibhamu. Do you get what I'm saying? So things are about to be popping, right? Things are about to get real. And so it sets it up quite interestingly, right? While all these fights happen within the ANC, continue to happen within the GNU, and the DA faction of the ANC, it pretends as if it, is not really happy with if things as they are, they will continue to undermine policies and laws in various ways. But it all adds up to this, that the day, should that day come, that there is a unification, first of all, of the progressive bloc on the ground, not just in parliament, right? But also they win elections. Yeah, I wonder how then things are going to be like in South Africa. Prepare yourselves. Do you agree or disagree?